The call came in just after midnight, a clipped, urgent tone from the senior investigator. User SZ, we have a situation. Remote, sensitive. We're going to need full biohazard protocols. My eyelids felt like sandpaper, but the words cut through the fatigue. Location? I'd asked, already reaching for my go bag. The answer had been a dead weight in the pit of my stomach. A specific, classified address I knew belonged to the quarantine facility. Unknown pathogen suspected. Even for me, a forensic pathologist accustomed to the grim theater of death, this was a step beyond. The place was a fortress buried deep in a forgotten corner of the industrial park, veiled by high walls and an almost unnatural silence. Its very existence whispered of secrets, of things best left undisturbed. Now, death had breached its pristine, isolated walls. The journey was a blur of flashing lights and hushed radio chatter. When we finally arrived, the scene was already cordoned off by a perimeter of uniformed officers, their faces grim beneath the harsh glare of portable floodlights. The air tasted metallic, sharp with the tang of ozone from the facility's filtration systems. I exchanged a nod with the lead detective, a stocky woman with eyes that had seen too much, even for her years. Her usual brusqueness was replaced by a strained quiet. User SZ, he began, his voice low. It's unusual even for here. Unusual was an understatement. After navigating a labyrinth of sterile corridors and multiple airlocks, each requiring a precise sequence of decontamination, I found myself standing before a heavy-duty, reinforced door. It was the entrance to one of the facility's primary containment units, designed to keep everything inside in and everything outside out. The air within the facility hummed with the constant, low thrum of ventilation systems, a sound that usually suggested order, but here felt like a suffocating blanket. No forced entry, the detective stated, gesturing to the door. Electronically sealed from the inside. No breach of the outer perimeter, no signs of anyone else entering or exiting the facility since the victim arrived yesterday afternoon. I scanned the seamless metal, the flush-mounted access panel. Not a scratch, not a dent. It looked as if it had never been touched by anything but the soft brush of a cleaning cloth. My mind immediately began to cycle through possibilities, discarding each one as quickly as it formed. A locked room mystery, yes, but this wasn't some Victorian manor with a hidden passage. This was a purpose-built containment unit designed to be impermeable. The facility's chief of security, a man whose shoulders seemed permanently hunched with the weight of responsibility, keyed in a code. A series of soft clicks and a hiss of depressurizing air preceded the slow, deliberate swing of the massive door. The scent hit me first, not the expected metallic tang of blood, but something sweeter, cloying like overripe fruit left too long in the sun, underlaid with the faint, clinical aroma of disinfectant. It was an unsettling combination. Inside, the containment unit was a small, Spartan chamber, roughly 6 by 6 meters. White walls, white floor. A single workstation dominating one side, illuminated by a harsh overhead fluorescent panel. And in the center of it all, sprawled on the pristine white floor, was the victim. He was a researcher, judging by the lab coat crumpled beneath him, a man in his late 40s, slight of build, with a shock of prematurely gray hair. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, a silent scream frozen in place. There was no visible trauma, no bullet wounds, no stab marks, no signs of a struggle. His hands were open, palms up, as if in supplication or surrender. I donned my triple-layered gloves, adjusting the fit of my respirator. The air in here felt different, heavy despite the active filtration. My gaze swept the room methodically. The workstation held a closed laptop, a neatly stacked pile of papers, and a half-empty mug. Everything seemed disturbingly orderly, untouched. "We haven't moved anything," the detective confirmed. Reading my thoughts. Security cameras inside this unit are offline. External cameras show nothing out of the ordinary. Offline, in a facility like this, that was a significant detail. A glaring, anomalous gap in an otherwise meticulously monitored environment. My internal clock started ticking, racing through the chain of events. A deliberate act or a convenient coincidence? Nothing was ever truly a coincidence in these cases. I knelt beside the victim, my eyes tracing every inch of his body. No obvious weapon anywhere, no signs of a struggle, no scattered papers, no overturned chair. It was as if he had simply ceased to be. The forensic technician, a quiet woman with nimble fingers, began her perimeter sweep, documenting every angle, every surface. "See anything, user SZ?" the detective asked, his voice tight with suppressed frustration. I didn't answer immediately. My gaze was fixed on the victim's left hand. It was slightly curled, and clutched loosely in his fingers was a small, rectangular piece of what looked like paper, no bigger than a postage stamp. It was creased, almost crumpled, and its edges were slightly frayed. It seemed entirely out of place in this pristine, high-tech environment. I carefully used tweezers to retrieve it, holding it up for closer inspection. It was thick, almost like cardstock, and blank on both sides. No print, no writing, no discernible pattern. Just a small, unassuming rectangle. It felt deliberate, like a message or an attempt at one that never quite materialized. "A calling card," the security chief muttered, peering over my shoulder. I shook my head slowly. "Or a distraction." I placed it carefully into a sterile evidence bag. This was more than just a locked room. My mind, usually a well-oiled machine of deduction, felt momentarily stalled. Every instinct screamed that something was profoundly wrong. But the physical evidence, or rather the lack of it, was a blank wall. How could someone be murdered in a sealed chamber, with no weapon, no entry, no exit, and nothing disturbed? Had I missed something fundamental? Was there an angle so obvious, so simple, that my trained eye had somehow overlooked it in its search for complexity? I pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the faint, sweet smell. It was still there, clinging to the air, subtly at odds with the cleanroom sterility. It was the only tangible anomaly, other than the dead man himself, in a room that otherwise screamed nothing happened here. This wasn't just a challenge, it was an affront, a direct dare from an unseen adversary, and I, user SZ, intended to answer it. Remote, sensitive, the biting chill of the night, even through the sealed windows of my vehicle, couldn't quite match the cold, not tightening in my stomach. The senior investigator's voice had been tight, clipped, kind that promised a situation far beyond the usual grim catalog of human failings. "User SZ, we have a situation. Remote, sensitive. You're going to need full biohazard." The rest of his words had been a blur of protocols and coordinates, painting a picture of isolation and extreme caution. Now, hours later, the facility loomed out of the pre-dawn gloom, a stark, windowless monolith against the bruised sky. This was no ordinary crime scene. This was a quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected. The name itself hummed with an unsettling resonance, a silent warning. My breath plumed in the frigid air as I exited the transport, the crunch of gravel under my boots echoing in the oppressive silence. Two figures, shrouded in full hazardous material suits, met me at the perimeter. They looked like specters, faceless and impersonal, their radios crackling with muffled exchanges. One I recognized by his gait was the senior investigator. The other, a younger officer, seemed to vibrate with nervous energy. "User SZ, the senior investigator's voice came through my comm unit, distorted but recognizable. "Glad you could make it. The situation hasn't changed. Still a puzzle wrapped in an enigma." "And the victim?" I asked, my own voice surprisingly steady. I always found a strange calm in the face of the truly bizarre. It narrowed my focus, sharpened my senses. Male. Mid-40s. He was found in a locked room, sealed from the inside. No signs of forced entry. No weapon recovered. Preliminary assessment from the first responders indicated blunt force trauma, but no trace of anyone leaving. "It's impossible. Impossible." The word hung in the air, a challenge. I'd heard it before, usually from those who hadn't learned to look past the obvious. My job was to peel back the layers of the impossible, to find the tiny, overlooked truths that made sense of the senseless. "Let's see if the body agrees with impossible," I murmured, more to myself than to them. The entry sequence was an exercise in methodical paranoia. Decontamination chambers, airlocks, the constant hiss of filtered air. I donned my own biohazard suit, a cumbersome, suffocating second skin that muffled sound and restricted movement. The world became a tunnel, viewed through a plastic visor, every breath a mechanical effort. My own past doubts, moments where I'd questioned my instincts, flickered at the edge of my mind, a reminder to be meticulous, to trust only what I saw, what I felt. The preparation room inside the facility was sterile, stark white, and unnervingly quiet. The body lay on a stainless steel table, covered by a sheet. Even through the thick visor, the air felt heavy, charged with unanswered questions. The younger officer stood a respectful distance away, his posture rigid. The senior investigator motioned for me to proceed. I approached the table, my gloved hands feeling clumsy in the thick material. Pulling back the sheet, I took a deep, filtered breath. The victim's face was pale, serene, almost peaceful. He looked like he was simply asleep, a stark contrast to the violence implied by the blunt force trauma report. This immediately struck me as odd. Violent deaths usually leave some trace of the struggle, a residual tension in the facial muscles. I began my external examination, my eyes scanning every inch of exposed skin. The initial report had mentioned blunt force trauma. I expected significant bruising, perhaps a depressed skull fracture, or at least some obvious impact points. But as I meticulously worked my way from head to toe, I found nothing of the sort. His scalp was intact, no lacerations, no hematomas. His neck, shoulders, chest, all clear. I ran my gloved fingers along his ribs, feeling for any anomalies, any crepitus indicating a fracture. Nothing. His arms lay neatly at his sides, the hands unmarred. No defensive wounds, no broken nails, no skin under them. They were clean, almost unnaturally so. There are no signs of blunt force trauma here, I stated, my voice flat, echoing slightly in my comm unit. None that I can detect externally anyway. The senior investigator grunted. That's what's bothering us. The initial responders were pretty certain they saw blood. Blood can come from many sources, I replied, my gaze fixed on the victim's left arm. There on the inner elbow, barely visible against the pale skin, was a tiny, almost imperceptible pinprick. It wasn't bruised, wasn't inflamed, but it was definitely a disruption of the epidermal layer. And another, almost a twin, on the right arm. I leaned closer, adjusting the light. The marks were exceedingly small, almost like a mosquito bite, but without the characteristic raised bump. They were too clean, too precise to be accidental, and they were bilateral. That wasn't coincidence. Wait a moment, I said, a new current of thought sparking. My eyes traced the path of the veins. These aren't blunt force trauma. I carefully angled the arm, looking for any other anomalies. Beneath the pinprick on the right arm, near the wrist, I detected an even fainter discoloration, like a ghost of a bruise no larger than my thumbnail. It wasn't impact damage. It looked different. Chemical, perhaps. This didn't add up. A locked room, no visible entry or exit, no weapon, and a victim reported to have died from blunt force trauma, yet showing absolutely no external signs of it. Instead, I had these precise, tiny marks, almost hidden, suggesting something far more deliberate, far more insidious than a simple blow to the head. This wasn't a struggle. This wasn't a rage-fueled attack. This was something else entirely, a careful, calculated act. I moved to the victim's mouth, gently prying it open. The tongue was slightly discolored, a faint bluish tinge, but no signs of choking or strangulation. I checked the back of his throat and then his nostrils, nothing remarkable. I continued my external survey, running my gloved hand over the victim's clothing. It was neat, undisturbed, not ripped or torn. This man hadn't fought for his life. He hadn't resisted, or if he had, it was against something that left no outward mark of struggle. The initial assessment was wrong, I announced, my voice firm. This wasn't blunt force trauma. I paused, letting the statement sink in. And these marks, they suggest a very different scenario, something far more controlled. I looked up, meeting the senior investigator's visor-obscured gaze. The impossible just got a whole lot more complicated, and a whole lot more interesting. The sterile hum of the air filtration system was a welcome counterpoint to the unsettling silence I'd left behind at the scene. Driving back to the quarantine facility, unknown pathogens suspected had felt like shedding layers of an invisible, oppressive cloak. The senior investigator's visor-obscured gaze still lingered in my mind. A silent challenge. The impossible just got a whole lot more complicated, and now it was my job to untangle it, one microscopic piece at a time. My lab, nestled deep within the facility, was a sanctuary of controlled chaos. Every surface gleamed, disinfected daily, a necessity given the facility's primary purpose. My colleagues, mostly researchers focused on biological threats, gave me a wide berth, a mutual respect for differing disciplines and the unique brand of meticulousness my work demanded. I preferred it that way. Fewer distractions meant sharper focus. First, the fibers. I laid out the collection sheets from the scene, each labeled with agonizing precision: victim's left sleeve, underneath victim's right shoe, door frame, inner surface. I donned my specialized gloves, not just for contamination control, but for the almost sacred ritual of handling silent witnesses. The first batch I focused on were minute threads plucked from the victim's clothing. Under the stereo microscope, they shimmered, almost iridescent. Not natural fibers, that much was clear. These weren't cotton or wool or silk. They were synthetic, a tightly woven polymer, almost metallic in their sheen. I adjusted the magnification, examining the structure. The individual strands were incredibly fine, almost like spider silk, yet strong, showing no signs of fraying despite the struggle indicated by other scene elements. This wasn't off-the-rack clothing material. This felt industrial, perhaps even specialized. I compared them to my extensive reference library of synthetic materials. Nothing matched precisely. The closest were some high-tensile strength composites used in specialized protective gear, or perhaps even aerospace components. My brow furrowed. Aerospace. In a residential locked-room murder, it felt like a discordant note in a carefully constructed symphony. I isolated a few strands for further analysis, logging their unique spectral signature into the facility's central database, hoping for a hit. There was a slight, almost imperceptible elasticity to them, a characteristic I made a note of. Next, the trace elements: dust, dirt, skin cells, hair fragments, the usual detritus of human existence. But among them, picked up by the specialized vacuum from the floorboards near the victim's outstretched hand, was something else. Tiny, almost invisible specks that glittered under the focused beam of light. I transferred them to a new slide. Under higher magnification, they resolved into microscopic metallic flakes, irregular in shape, but with a consistent, almost crystalline structure. They weren't iron or copper or aluminum. My initial spectral analysis suggested a complex alloy, rich in titanium and an unusual combination of rare earth elements. This wasn't garage floor dust. This was something engineered, something specific. I ran a quick search. The alloy profile was highly specialized, typically found in high-stress, low-weight applications. Think precision instruments, high-performance machinery, or again, aerospace. The same discordant note, louder this time. My internal clock was ticking, not just the real one, but the one that measured my patience against the escalating complexity. I took a deep breath, letting the sterile air fill my lungs. This was where the real work began. The initial sweep was done. Now the deep dive. The chemical residues were next. A faint, almost imperceptible film on the victim's hands, specifically the palms, and surprisingly on the inner surface of the doorknob, the one that had been locked from the inside. I'd taken swabs, careful to avoid cross-contamination. I ran the samples through the facility's advanced mass spectrometer, a behemoth of polished steel and intricate tubing. The results started trickling in, lines on a screen, peaks and valleys representing molecular structures. Most were benign: skin oils, residual cleaning agents from the room, faint traces of food. But then, a distinct, anomalous signature began to emerge from the doorknob swab. It was a polymer, a very specific type of adhesive. Not a common superglue, nothing that would leave obvious residue or stickiness. This was a sophisticated, fast-acting, high-strength bonding agent designed to be almost invisible once cured, and the chemical markers indicated it had been applied very recently before I arrived at the scene. An adhesive on the inside of a doorknob. Why? To prevent it from being opened, but it was locked from the inside. If the killer had been inside, they wouldn't need to seal it. Unless the lock itself was compromised, or more unsettlingly, unless the killer had never been inside in the first place. Then, the second part of the chemical analysis from the victim's palms came through. Another anomaly. A residue, almost waxy, but with an incredibly low friction coefficient. It wasn't a common lubricant. The spectral analysis pointed to a highly specialized fluoropolymer, resistant to extreme temperatures and pressures, designed for minimal friction between moving parts. It was the kind of substance I'd find in precision bearings or high-end mechanical components. I leaned back, pushing away from the console, the chair squeaking faintly. The gray fibers, the titanium-rich metallic flakes, the invisible adhesive, and now this high-tech lubricant. They painted a picture. It wasn't one I could easily reconcile with a simple locked-room murder. Wait, I muttered to myself, the sound loud in the quiet lab. That doesn't add up. If the victim had handled something coated in this lubricant, something that also shed the unique fibers and metallic flakes. What could it be? And the adhesive on the doorknob. It felt like a deliberate misdirection or a clue to a mechanism I hadn't even considered. The senior investigator's words echoed, no apparent entry, exit, or weapon. What if the weapon wasn't a conventional one? What if it was something that used these materials? Something that was never in the room, but operated on it? My mind raced, trying to bridge the gap between these disparate, high-tech clues and the mundane reality of a residential building. The tension in my shoulders ratcheted up another notch. This wasn't just a murder, it was a carefully engineered puzzle, and I had just found a handful of very unusual pieces. And the implication of those pieces was far more unsettling than I had anticipated. The technical challenge of it all still buzzed in my skull, a persistent static of unanswered questions. My mind had been racing since I left that apartment, trying to bridge the gap between those disparate high-tech clues, the odd residue, the faint electromagnetic signatures, and the mundane reality of a residential building. A weapon that wasn't in the room, but operated on it. It felt like a riddle designed to mock every conventional forensic principle I held. My current surroundings did little to soothe the intellectual itch. I was at the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected, a place that hummed with a different kind of tension. The air, filtered and recirculated, felt unnaturally thin, carrying the faint, metallic scent of ozone and disinfectant. Every surface gleamed, sterile and unforgiving. I moved through a series of airlocks, the heavy doors hissing shut behind me, each one a physical manifestation of the invisible barrier we were trying to maintain. My level 4 protective suit was cumbersome, a second skin of synthetic fabric and clear visor, making every movement deliberate, every breath a conscious effort. The muffled sounds of my own breathing were the loudest noise in the examination chamber, save for the low thrum of the ventilation system. I was examining a particular piece of the victim's clothing. Silk scarf, now bagged and sealed. It wasn't the primary focus of the initial investigation, but I'd insisted it be brought here for a more detailed sweep. The police, especially the lead detective, were already convinced they had their man. User SZ, you're making work for yourself. The detective had grumbled over the secure comms earlier, his voice distorted through my suit's speaker. He sounded exasperated, tired. We've got a solid lead. The business partner, a Mr. Thorne, motive as clear as day, a massive financial dispute, a public shouting match just last week. He had a key too, though he claims he gave it back months ago. We found a spare in his desk drawer, just like the victim's. A spare key doesn't explain a locked door, detective, I'd countered, my voice flat, echoing slightly in my helmet. And it certainly doesn't explain the lack of forced entry, the total absence of a weapon. He could have locked it from the outside with a tool or, I don't know, a trick lock, he'd said, his irritation palpable. People get creative when they are angry enough, and we're still looking for the weapon. It could be anything. Point is, the man's got motive and opportunity, and he's not exactly denying the bad blood. I hadn't argued further. I knew how the system worked. When a suspect with a clear motive presented themselves, the investigation tended to narrow. But my gut and the peculiar evidence from the scene told a different story. Under the bright, cold lights of the examination chamber, I carefully unfolded the scarf. It was a rich crimson, a stark contrast to the sterile white of my gloves. The fabric was fine, almost translucent in places. My magnified vision, courtesy of the integrated optics in my helmet, allowed me to scrutinize every thread. I was looking for anything unusual, anything that shouldn't be there, or perhaps anything that wasn't there that should be. My fingers, clumsy in the thick gloves, manipulated a pair of micro tweezers. I methodically scraped the fabric, collecting minute particles onto a sterile slide. The preliminary scan hadn't revealed anything overtly suspicious, no blood, no common accelerants, no fibers from an obvious struggle. But I wasn't looking for the obvious. And then I saw it, or rather, I didn't see it in the way I expected. The scarf, despite its delicate nature, showed no signs of stress, no pulled threads, no snags that would suggest a struggle, however brief. The victim, according to the initial assessment, hadn't put up a fight. This aligned with the lack of defensive wounds on the body itself. But if the business partner, a man known for his volatile temper, had killed the victim in a fit of rage, wouldn't there be some sign of physical interaction? A push, a grab, something to disrupt the pristine surface of the scarf? The absence felt louder than any presence. I adjusted the focus, bringing a microscopic section into sharper relief. There, embedded deep within the silk fibers, was a scattering of metallic dust, not the kind of everyday particulate I'd find anywhere. This was a specific alloy, almost crystalline in structure, shimmering faintly under the high-intensity light. It was similar, though not identical, to the residue I'd found on the strange, high-tech components back at the apartment. My brow furrowed inside my helmet, a gesture no one could see. If Mr. Thorne, the disgruntled business partner, was the killer, how did this specific metallic dust end up on the victim's scarf? He worked in finance, not advanced metallurgy or semiconductor manufacturing. His apartment, which the police had already swept, yielded nothing remotely similar. This wasn't a common industrial byproduct. It was specialized, refined. I felt that familiar tug of doubt. Could I be chasing phantoms, caught up in the allure of the complex when the truth was as blunt as a hammer blow? Was I overthinking it, letting my fascination with the obscure blind me to a simple, brutal act of passion? The detective wanted a quick resolution, and Mr. Thorne fit the bill perfectly. But the dust, the absence of struggle, the locked room, the lack of a conventional weapon, they were all dissonant notes in the detective's neat melody. This wasn't just a disgruntled business partner losing his temper. This was something else, something precise, something that left a signature so subtle, so specific, that it screamed planned rather than spontaneous rage. The inconsistencies were nagging at me, growing louder with every passing minute in this sterile, isolated chamber. They didn't clear Mr. Thorne entirely, no. But they certainly made his involvement in a simple, violent act far more complicated than anyone else seemed willing to admit. I hadn't argued further. Under the bright, cold lights of the examination chamber, I carefully unfolded a microscopic sliver of synthetic fiber, barely visible to the naked eye, retrieved from beneath the victim's fingernail. It didn't match anything found at the scene, nor any of the initial suspect's belongings. A phantom thread, hinting at a presence that should not have been there. My phone buzzed, a sharp, insistent vibration against the stainless steel table. It was the digital forensics specialist. User SZ, I need to come down to the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected. Now, I've got something unexpected. A knot tightened in my stomach. The quarantine facility. A place reserved for cases deemed too volatile, too sensitive, or too biologically hazardous for regular handling. It was an extreme measure, even for sensitive digital data. I packed my instruments, the phantom thread secured in a clear evidence bag, the image of the victim's serene, lifeless face still haunting my peripheral vision. The drive was short but felt interminable. The city, usually a symphony of horns and hurried footsteps, seemed muted, hushed. Approaching the facility, the air grew heavy. Thick with a scent I couldn't quite place, a mix of industrial cleaner and something vaguely chemical, like a freshly scrubbed laboratory, but with an underlying metallic tang. Security was tighter than I'd ever experienced. Barricades, guards in full protective gear, their faces obscured by visors, stood sentinel. Each checkpoint felt like an interrogation, even with my official clearance. Inside, the environment was a study in stark, clinical efficiency. Fluorescent lights hummed, casting long, unsettling shadows. The walls were sterile white, the floors polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting the occasional masked figure moving with a purpose that bordered on urgency. Every door required a keycard and a biometric scan. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the soft whir of air filtration systems and the distant clatter of something heavy being moved. I felt an immediate, primal urge to check my own breath, to ensure no foreign particles entered my system. This wasn't just about digital evidence. The very atmosphere suggested a deeper, unseen threat. I found the digital forensics specialist in a small, windowless room, bathed in the blue glow of multiple monitors. They sat hunched over a keyboard, gloved hands flying across the keys. A clear plastic screen separated us, a barrier against whatever unseen pathogen was deemed a risk. Even their voice, when they spoke, sounded slightly muffled through a respirator mask. User SZ, they said, not looking up. Their eyes, visible through the visor, were bloodshot, weary. This is not what we expected. They gestured to a central monitor. The victim's personal devices. Initially, they appeared clean. A few emails, social media, nothing out of the ordinary. A life as mundane as anyone else's, but then I found it, a hidden partition, deeply encrypted. My eyebrows rose. A hidden partition? What was it hiding? The specialist finally looked at me, their head shaking slowly. Not hiding exactly, more like a separate existence. The victim, it seems, led a double life, a very elaborate, very intense double life. They typed a few more commands and the screen shifted, displaying a complex, almost fantastical interface. It was a visual feast of intricate graphics, stylized avatars, and scrolling chat logs. This, the specialist explained, their voice gaining a strange inflection, a mix of awe and bewilderment, is a high-stakes, anonymous online gaming community. Not my average video game. This is an ecosystem. Players adopt elaborate personas, engage in complex, long-running narratives, and compete for real-world stakes. Money, influence, secrets. Some of these games involve actual data acquisition, infiltration, even social engineering. I leaned closer to the plastic barrier, squinting at the screen. The victim's avatar was a cloaked figure named Nick's Shadow. The chat log scrolled rapidly, filled with cryptic jargon and intense exchanges. Real-world stakes, I echoed, the phrase hanging heavy in the sterile air. How high are we talking? Some of the prize pools I've seen mentioned. 6 figures aren't uncommon. But it's not just about money. There's a currency of information, of leverage. Reputations are built and destroyed in these virtual arenas. Rivalries run deep. I've found references to hits, not literal assassinations, but digital takedowns. Ruining someone's real-world career, exposing their secrets, that kind of thing. The specialist pulled up a profile page for Nick's Shadow. It listed a series of achievements and victories that seemed to involve outsmarting other players, uncovering their vulnerabilities. My mind reeled. The victim I had encountered in that locked room, the one with the meticulously curated life, the one whose death was initially attributed to a simple personal motive. That person was a phantom, a carefully constructed facade for a ruthless online competitor. So the victim wasn't just playing games, I murmured, my gaze fixed on the screen. They were living another life entirely, a life where their actions had very real, very dangerous consequences. The specialist nodded. Exactly, and given the nature of some of these games, anonymity is paramount. Revealing a player's true identity or doxing them is considered the ultimate betrayal. Some of the chat logs suggest Nick's Shadow was particularly skilled at this. They had a reputation for digging up dirt. The initial suspect, the one with the clear personal motive, suddenly felt like a red herring, or at best, a single thread in a much larger, far more intricate tapestry. The locked room, which had seemed so impenetrable, now felt like a stage carefully set for an audience that existed only in the digital ether. The lack of entry or exit points, the missing weapon, the absolute precision of the crime. Someone who saw the victim not as a person, but as an opponent to be eliminated, perhaps in the most theatrical, perplexing way possible. I felt a sudden jolt of doubt. Had I misread everything? Had I been so focused on the physical impossibility that I'd missed the true nature of the victim? The victim's meticulousness, their guarded nature, their apparent lack of close connections, it all fit. The quiet, unassuming individual in real life was a digital predator. This wasn't just a complication, it was a complete redefinition of the entire case. The suspect pool had just exploded, extending into an anonymous digital world where motives were veiled and identities were fluid. The sterile scent of disinfectant, sharp and unyielding, was the first thing that assaulted me as I stepped into the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected. It clung to the air, thick and cloying, attempting to mask the faint, metallic tang I'd grown accustomed to associating with containment, with things best kept separate. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, insistent buzz overhead, casting a harsh, shadowless glare on the polished concrete floors and stark white walls. This wasn't a place designed for comfort, but for control, for absolute isolation. It felt less like a lab and more like a high-security vault, which, given the sensitivity of the digital evidence we were about to dissect, was probably the point. My boots echoed in the silence as a security officer, clad in a full-body hazmat suit, despite the assurances that the pathogen risk was contained, waved me through a series of automated doors. Each hiss and clunk of a sealing mechanism felt like a new layer of psychological pressure. I peeled off my outer jacket, revealing the clean, pressed shirt beneath, a small act of defiance against the overwhelming sense of clinical sterility. The digital forensics expert was already hunched over a bank of monitors in a small, windowless room deeper within the facility. They looked up as I entered, their face illuminated by the cool glow of a dozen screens displaying streams of indecipherable code and complex network diagrams. "User SZ," they said, their voice calm, almost detached. "Good to see you. I've prepped everything as you requested." "Thanks," I replied, pulling up a chair beside them. "My gut tells me the answers aren't just in the room where the victim was found, in the life they led before." I paused, remembering the staged scene, especially the life they broadcast, thought they concealed online. The expert nodded, their fingers already dancing across a keyboard. "I've pulled everything I could find on the victim public profiles, archived web pages, forum posts, deep web scrapes. It's quite a digital footprint." "Anything jump out immediately?" I asked, leaning closer, my eyes scanning the rapid scroll of data. On the surface, no. Typical online presence for someone in their field. Active in professional groups, some casual social media, a few niche hobbies. But they paused when I started digging into the private messages and encrypted communications. It gets interesting. My internal alarm bells, which had been buzzing faintly since I'd left the crime scene, began to ring a little louder. Interesting how, rivalries for one, the victim was working on something significant, something cutting-edge in their industry. There were quite a few veiled comments on a professional forum, almost dismissive from a competitor. Not outright threats, but a consistent pattern of undermining the victim's ideas and questioning their integrity. The expert pulled up a thread, highlighting a series of exchanges. "See here, amateur hour, trying to pass off old concepts as new breakthroughs." And another, "Some people would do anything for a shortcut to the top, even if it means stepping on others' intellectual property." It's subtle, persistent. A smear campaign maybe, I mused, picturing the competitor's face, a man with a history of aggressive business tactics. Enough to create professional animosity, not necessarily murder. Perhaps not directly, the expert conceded, but it establishes a motive of professional jealousy. And then there are these. They clicked another tab, revealing a series of anonymous messages sent to the victim's personal email. These are more direct, not just professional criticism, but actual threats. I squinted at the screen. The messages were short, cryptic. "Stop digging. Some things are better left buried." And this one, I read, "Playing with fire. I'll get burned." My mind immediately jumped back to the meticulous staging of the crime scene, the theatricality of it. There was the killer trying to send a message, not just to the victim, to someone else. These started appearing about 6 months ago, escalating in frequency in the last 2 months, the expert explained. The IP addresses are masked, bounced through multiple servers, less than legal activities. This was it. This was the wait that doesn't add up moment. The locked room, the impossible murder had felt almost too perfect, too clean. These online threats, however, were messy, aggressive, and decidedly not clean. They spoke of a different kind of killer, a more volatile one perhaps. I felt a flicker of doubt. Was I getting too caught up in the theatricality of the crime scene, missing a simpler, more brutal explanation? No, the sheer impossibility of the locked room couldn't be ignored. "And the secret project?" I prompted, pushing past my momentary self-doubt. The premise was that the victim was working on something worth a fortune. This had to be the key. The expert typed a few more commands. "Ah yes, this is where it gets really interesting." The victim was collaborating with a small, highly secretive collective. They operated almost entirely off the public grid, using encrypted channels and private servers. It took me days to even find a trace. A new screen popped up, displaying a series of heavily redacted documents and fragmented communications. They were developing a new form of digital currency, not just a cryptocurrency, but something that integrated with real-world assets in a completely novel way. A system designed to bypass traditional financial institutions entirely. My breath hitched. Bypass traditional institutions? That's not just worth a fortune, that's disruptive, that's a paradigm shift, that's something established powers would kill to control or to destroy. Precisely, the expert said, their voice gaining a rare edge of excitement. The potential value, if successful, is in the hundreds of billions, maybe even trillions, and there are indications that they were very close to a major breakthrough, a public launch even. They zoomed in on a snippet of a conversation. One message from the victim to another member of the collective just days before the murder. The final piece is in place. We're ready to change everything. Just need to secure the last few data points and we're golden. The implications hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about a rival or a personal grudge. This was about power, about an invention that could reshape the global economy. The locked room, the theatrical staging, the impossible circumstances, they suddenly made a twisted kind of sense. It wasn't just a murder, it was a statement. The tapestry was indeed growing larger and far more dangerous. The sterile hum of the air filtration system in the quarantine facility. Unknown pathogen suspected was the only sound for miles, it felt like. Each breath I took through my respirator felt filtered, scrubbed clean, just like the air itself. The vast, windowless chamber where I'd set up my temporary analysis station was a stark contrast to the chaotic crime scene, yet the tension here was a different, more insidious beast. It wasn't the urgency of discovery, but the suffocating weight of what I'd already found and what it implied. My realization from the previous night that the murder wasn't a simple vendetta, but a calculated move in a high-stakes game for a world-altering invention had settled deep into my bones. It explained the theatricality, the impossible setup, but it didn't explain how. The locked room still mocked me with its silent defiance. I was hunched over the main console, the glow of the monitors painting my face in cool blues and greens. On one screen, magnified images of the trace evidence from the victim's premises swirled. Specifically, I was focused on the microscopic, iridescent microfragments I'd meticulously collected from the victim's clothing and the immediate vicinity of the body. They weren't just dust. They were almost crystalline, shimmering with a subtle internal light, and they had been arranged in a faint, almost fractal-like spiral pattern. I'd flagged them as unusual, beautiful even, but without context. They were just another pretty anomaly. On another screen, I had opened the victim's digital correspondence, particularly their heated exchanges with online rivals in the specialized field of their invention. There were three main contenders for the top spot, each a ghost in the machine, known only by their intricate digital personas. One, in particular, had always stood out to me. The victim had referred to them as the architect, a moniker that hinted at an obsession with intricate design and structure. I scrolled through their shared project files, the ones where they'd collaborated and then vehemently disagreed, each leaving their digital mark. The architect was known for their elaborate digital watermarks, custom icons, and unique graphical elements embedded deep within their code and documentation. It was a signature, a flourish that screamed ownership. My eyes narrowed, scanning the screen. I was looking for anything, any tiny thread that might connect this virtual world to the physical one I inhabited. The victim's last message to the architect was particularly vitriolic, ending with a stylized, almost abstract symbol. It was a recurring motif in all of the architect's communications, their digital fingerprint. I zoomed in on it, isolating the image. It was a spiral, not just any spiral, but a complex, multi-layered fractal, almost organic in its growth pattern, yet clearly artificial in its precision. My breath hitched in my throat, the filtered air suddenly feeling too thin. I flicked back to the magnified image of the trace evidence, the iridescent microfragments arranged on the victim's sleeve. I toggled the overlay function, aligning the digital symbol with the physical pattern. A cold shiver, not from the facility's regulated temperature, ran down my spine. It was identical. The same intricate, branching structure, the same logarithmic curve, the same underlying artistic intent. The subtle, shimmering flecks on the victim's body were arranged in a pattern that precisely mirrored the architect's distinctive digital signature. I leaned back, my chair scraping faintly on the polished floor. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the impossible. How could a digital symbol, an abstract artistic watermark, manifest as physical trace evidence in a locked room? This wasn't a coincidence. It was a deliberate, almost taunting signature left by the killer. Wait, I muttered to myself, my voice muffled by the respirator. That doesn't add up. My initial excitement began to curdle into a gnawing doubt. There was I seeing what I wanted to see. There was the pressure making me draw connections where none truly existed. I was tired, isolated, and the weight of this case felt immense. I knew my mind could play tricks. I meticulously rechecked my analysis, comparing every angle, every curve, every minute detail of the digital symbol against the microscopic scan of the physical residue. I used different filters, adjusted the light sources, ran comparison algorithms. Each test confirmed it. The congruence was undeniable. The physical manifestation was not merely similar, it was a precise, almost perfect, three-dimensional echo of the digital pattern. This wasn't just a rival. This was the architect. And the architect wasn't just a faceless online entity. They had a physical presence, a tangible connection to the crime scene, to the victim, to the very fabric of this impossible murder. The iridescent microfragments weren't some random environmental contaminant. They were a deliberate, almost artistic, calling card. A killer who used their digital signature as a physical clue. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. It meant the architect hadn't just been involved in the victim's digital world. They had been physically present. The locked room, the lack of entry points, it all screamed a different kind of manipulation, a deeper level of deception than I had ever imagined. My initial doubt evaporated, replaced by a surge of grim determination. This wasn't just about a stolen invention anymore. It was about exposing a killer who believed themselves untouchable, weaving their persona into the very fabric of the crime. The game had just become infinitely more complicated, and I, user SZ, was ready to play. The vast, windowless chamber where I'd set up my temporary analysis station was a fortress against the unseen, a bubble of meticulously controlled air and light. But even here, isolated with my thoughts and the silent witnesses of the crime, the killer's presence felt disturbingly close. I leaned over the illuminated table. The digital autopsy report projected onto its surface. My fingers, clad in double-layered gloves, traced the contours of the victim's physiological data. No forced entry, no obvious trauma, no discernible weapon. The initial profile I'd constructed a rival, someone driven by professional jealousy, aiming to outwit me, to prove superior intellect felt. Incomplete. It was too broad, too impersonal for the sheer theatricality of the act. A locked room wasn't just a puzzle. It was a statement, but what statement and to whom? My gaze drifted to the series of schematics I'd meticulously drawn, detailing the victim's final environment, the impossible angles, the subtle misdirections. I'd focused so much on the how, on dissecting the mechanics of the impossible, that I felt I was missing the why. The killer was undeniably brilliant, a master of misdirection, but genius alone didn't explain the elaborate setup. It hinted at something deeper, a personal investment that transcended mere competition. I tapped a stylus against the table, bringing up the victim's digital footprint, a sparse, almost ghost-like presence online, a stark contrast to the intricate digital web I'd expected from someone targeted by a tech-savvy killer. It was almost too clean, too deliberately erased. My earlier theory had posited the killer used digital manipulation to create the illusion of isolation, to orchestrate the locked room effect from afar. I'd imagined a digital puppet master pulling strings from the shadows, but the victim's digital life suggested they weren't particularly susceptible to complex online manipulation. They were a simple target, almost. "Wait a minute," I murmured, my voice muffled by the respirator. If the victim wasn't digitally sophisticated, then the killer's digital wizardry wasn't meant to manipulate the victim. It was meant to manipulate me. It was a performance, a grand illusion designed not for the immediate target, but for the forensic eye that would eventually scrutinize it. This shift in perspective felt like a cold draft against my skin, despite the carefully regulated temperature of the facility. The killer wasn't just trying to outsmart me. They were performing for me, and that realization twisted the knife in my gut. It meant the killer wasn't just a rival, they knew me. I scrubbed back through my own internal database, the mental archive of every baffling case, every unresolved anomaly. My mind raced, searching for a pattern, a signature that resonated with this twisted performance. And then it clicked, a faint echo from a distant past. Years ago, early in my career, I'd consulted on a string of disappearances, a series of cases where individuals simply vanished from their lives, leaving behind perfectly normal, albeit digitally sterile, existences. We'd theorized about a master manipulator, someone who could psychologically dismantle a person's will, coercing them into a self-imposed exile, making them walk away from everything. The psychological component was always the most elusive, the hardest to prove. But one detail from those old files now screamed at me: the subtle, almost imperceptible signs of cognitive dissonance in the victim's last known communications. A forced cheerfulness, a slight deviation in their usual linguistic patterns, a meticulousness in their final actions that felt unnatural. It was the same unsettling precision I was seeing in this victim's final moments, the carefully arranged personal items, the lack of struggle, the almost serene acceptance of their fate. It wasn't just manipulation, it was a profound, insidious form of psychological dominance. The killer wasn't merely creating a locked room, they were creating a locked mind. My hands clenched into fists, the sterile gloves crinkling. This wasn't about proving a new theory, this was about a personal vendetta. Someone wasn't just challenging my intellect, they were challenging my past, throwing my own unresolved cases back in my face. They were showing me how it should have been done, or perhaps how they had done it and gotten away with it. Had my own focus on the physical evidence, my reliance on the tangible, blinded me to the true nature of their methodology all those years ago? Had my inability to prove the psychological component then allowed this predator to hone their craft, perfecting the art of the invisible cage? A security officer, clad in similar protective gear, approached my station. "User SZ, are I all right in here? I've been very still for a while." Their voice was a low rumble through their own respirator. I straightened up, trying to compose myself, to project an image of calm professionalism. "I'm fine," I replied, my voice raspy, "just connecting some dots." "Any breakthroughs?" the officer asked, their gaze sweeping over my workspace, likely seeing nothing but abstract data and diagrams. "More like a re-evaluation," I answered, looking back at the projected data. "The killer isn't just clever, they are profoundly invested, and I think they have a history, a long one." The officer waited, but I offered no more. I couldn't, not yet. The full implication of what I was realizing was too unsettling. If this killer had been lurking in the periphery of my career, watching, learning, perhaps even feeding off my failures, then this case was far more dangerous than I had initially grasped. This wasn't just a challenge, it was an invitation, and I had a sickening feeling I knew the host. The air filtration hummed on, a constant reminder of my isolation, of the invisible threats that could penetrate even the most secure environments. The killer wasn't just a rival, they were a ghost from my own professional past, returning with a vengeance, and they were very, very personal. The fluorescent lights of the quarantine facility, unknown pathogens suspected, hummed with a monotonous drone, a sound that had become the soundtrack to my gnawing thoughts. My breath fogged the inside of my face shield with every exhalation, a constant reminder of the unseen threat supposedly lurking outside our sealed environment. But the pathogen wasn't what I was truly afraid of. It was the other kind of infection, the insidious kind that had burrowed into the core of this case, twisting logic and preying on perception. I stood before a bank of monitors, my gloved fingers hovering over a digital forensic workstation. The air, filtered and recirculated, felt stale against my skin, even through the layers of protective gear. The silence, broken only by the hum of machinery and my own breathing, was a heavy blanket. The officer assigned to assist me, a meticulous but quiet sort, sat across the room, reviewing incident logs, his presence a faint echo. The realization from the previous chapter still prickled at the back of my neck. Watching, learning, feeding off my failures. It wasn't just a possibility anymore, it was a chilling certainty that solidified with every line of code I sifted through, every metadata timestamp I cross-referenced. This killer hadn't just committed a murder, they had crafted a narrative, a twisted performance for an audience of one, me. My gaze returned to the screen. There were discussions on advanced cryptography, digital ghosting techniques, and the psychological vulnerabilities inherent in network architecture. Nothing overtly criminal, but the language, the specific technical jargon, carried a unique signature. It was like recognizing a particular brushstroke in a master forgery. I'd spent the last 36 hours, interrupted only by brief, restless naps on a cart in an adjacent decontamination chamber, tracing these digital breadcrumbs. Then a flicker, a pattern emerged from the noise, an almost imperceptible digital watermark, buried deep within the forum server logs, pointed to a single highly sophisticated encryption key. Wait, I murmured, my voice muffled by the mask. That doesn't add up. My initial thought had been a copycat, someone mimicking the earlier unsolved crime. But the exactitude, the sheer elegance of the encryption was too precise. It was like finding the same unique fingerprint on two different, unrelated crime scenes. It defied probability. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up archived data from that old case. The details were hazy, tinged with the bitterness of defeat. The system had been breached, millions of proprietary data points stolen, and the culprit had disappeared into the digital ether, leaving behind no physical trace, only the impenetrable digital lock. I cross-referenced the encryption key with known publicly available data, then with a restricted database of individuals flagged for exceptional, almost superhuman digital prowess. The list was short, curated, and held names that rarely saw the light of day. And there, staring back at me, was one name that made my breath catch in my throat. Reveal/discovery. The profile image was a decade old, grainy, but the piercing intensity in the eyes was unmistakable. A brilliant, reclusive tech genius, known only in rarefied circles for their theoretical work on digital anonymity and psychological warfare in online environments. They had vanished from public life after a highly publicized academic dispute, claiming their ideas were being stolen, their genius unappreciated. Their last known digital activity, before fading completely, had been a series of scathing, anonymous posts railing against the mediocrity of the established order and the blindness of those who claim to seek truth. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying precision. The locked room, the invisible weapon, the digital manipulation of the victim's final moments, it all screamed of this individual's theoretical work made terrifyingly real. The motive, hidden in plain sight, wasn't about money or revenge in the conventional sense. It was about proving a point, about demonstrating intellectual superiority, about rubbing the faces of the established order, people like me in their own perceived failures. The killer wasn't just watching me, they were orchestrating a grand performance with my career as the ultimate prize. This wasn't just a suspect, this was the killer, and they were playing a game I had unknowingly been a part of for years. I have a name, I announced, my voice sharper than I intended. The officer looked up, his expression unreadable behind his own face shield. Who? He asked, his voice low. The architect of impossible spaces, I replied, my gaze still fixed on the screen, on the face of the reclusive tech genius. And they've been waiting for me to catch up. The immediate problem was how to approach someone who had perfected the art of digital disappearance. A direct warrant, a physical search, would be futile. They would be gone before we even knocked. We needed to lure them out, to make them reveal themselves. The killer thrived on intellectual challenges, on the illusion of control, on their perceived superiority. Event, we need to build a trap, I continued, turning to the officer. A digital one, something that speaks their language, something that appeals to their ego. My mind raced, formulating the plan. If the killer had been watching me, learning my patterns, then I had to use that against them. I had to create a scenario that mirrored their modus operandi, but with a crucial difference, a flaw, a bait that only they would recognize as a challenge. They use psychological manipulation, I explained, gesturing at the screen. They exploit digital vulnerabilities. They make impossible crimes seem real. We need to create an online puzzle, a forensic ghost story that appears to be unsolvable. We leak it subtly, through the same obscure forums they frequent. It has to be a crime that only someone with their unique skill set could have committed, and only someone with their ego would feel compelled to solve or comment on. The officer listened, his brow furrowed in concentration. A false flag operation? Exactly, I confirmed. We'll craft a scenario that seems to defy all known digital forensic techniques. A fabricated data breach, perhaps, or a simulated lock server theft with a signature encryption that's almost identical to theirs, but with one subtle, deliberate flaw. A flaw that only the original creator would spot and subsequently feel compelled to correct or expose. The tension in the room thickened, not from the pathogen outside, but from the dangerous game we were about to initiate. I knew this was risky. I was essentially waving a red flag at a brilliant, dangerous mind who held a personal vendetta against my professional existence. But it was the only way. The killer wouldn't come to us. We had to make them come to the challenge. We're baiting them, the officer said, a note of caution in his voice. Yes, I agreed, my gaze hardening. And we need to make sure the bait is irresistible. The stakes were no longer just about solving a murder. They were about confronting a ghost from my past, a challenge laid down years ago. Now come to claim its due. And this time I wouldn't fail. Not again. The air in the designated meeting zone of the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected, was thick with a stillness that hummed louder than any distant machinery. My breath plumed faintly in the chilled atmosphere, a stark contrast to the burning anticipation in my chest. The facility, typically a sterile labyrinth of sealed compartments and decontamination stations, felt like a stage set for a final act. The few security personnel, cloaked in protective gear, moved like silent specters, their presence a constant low thrum of readiness. Any movement, I murmured into my comms unit, my voice tight. My gaze was fixed on the main access corridor, a long, featureless tunnel that eventually led to the external world. The digital lure, my carefully constructed phantom, was out there, shimmering in the ether, waiting to draw its prey. I had crafted it with a precision born of intimate knowledge, not just of the killer's methods, but of their underlying psychology. It was a mirror, reflecting their own intellectual vanity, a challenge too tantalizing to ignore. A low crackle answered. Approach confirmed. User SZ, vehicle matches description. My grip tightened where I gripped the edge of a decontamination unit. This was it. The ghost from my past, the shadow that had taunted me for years, was finally stepping into the light. The old challenge, the silent competition that had festered in the corners of my mind, was about to be resolved. The heavy blast door at the end of the corridor began to retract with a slow, grinding groan. The sound echoed, amplifying the tension. A figure emerged, silhouetted against the pale, diffused light from outside. They moved with an unsettling calm, hands in their pockets, scanning the empty corridor. My breath hitched. It was them. The face I had studied in countless digital files, now flesh and blood. Welcome, I responded, stepping forward, my voice resonating in the cavernous space. The word felt like a gauntlet thrown. The figure paused, their eyes, even from this distance, seemed to lock onto mine. There was no surprise, no panic, only a flicker of something that looked like recognition and a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. It was a look that said, I knew I'd be here. User SZ. They replied, their voice cool, modulated, almost conversational. Always one step behind, aren't I? A jolt ran through me. It wasn't just the words, but the way they were delivered, a familiar cadence, a ghost of an old rivalry. It confirmed everything. This wasn't just a killer, it was the rival, the one whose brilliance had always been a twisted counterpoint to my own. My stomach clenched. This wasn't just about justice, it was personal. I think I'll find I'm exactly where I need to be, I countered, keeping my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. The game is over. As if on cue, the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected, suddenly came alive. The previously silent security personnel moved, blocking off the corridor behind the killer. Another team emerged from a side passage, forming a semicircle. The trap was sprung, neat and precise. The killer's gaze swept over the converging personnel, assessing the situation in a fraction of a second. The smirk didn't vanish, but it tightened. A bit theatrical, wouldn't I say, and rather inefficient. Before anyone could react, their hand moved with astonishing speed, not for a weapon, but to a device concealed on their wrist. A flash of light, a ripple in the air, and then the facility's internal lighting flickered erratically. The comms in my ear erupted with static. They're jamming us. A detective's voice shouted, distorted by the interference. All systems compromised. The blast door at the far end of the corridor, which had been slowly closing, suddenly shuddered and began to retract again, opening a sliver of an escape route. The killer moved, not running wildly, but with a calculated burst of speed, darting past the initial line of security. They're heading for the server farm, I yelled, my forensic mind already piecing together the pattern. The quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected, was built on top of an older municipal data center, a relic from the pre-digital age that had been repurposed but never fully decommissioned. It was their sanctuary, their battleground. They'll try to use the old network infrastructure, cut the power, the lead detective ordered, but it was too late. I didn't hesitate. After them, the chase was on. We pounded down the corridor, the shouts of the security personnel echoing around us. The killer, however, seemed to vanish and reappear, a phantom in the strobe-like emergency lighting. They were not just running, they were manipulating the very environment, using the facility's decaying systems against us. We burst through a heavy fire door, emerging into a vast, cavernous space, the heart of the old data center. Rows upon rows of server racks stretched into the distance, their indicator lights blinking like a million watchful eyes. It was a labyrinth of cold metal and humming energy. "Fan out, don't let them reach the core," the lead detective bellowed, his voice strained. I could hear the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of their running shoes on the raised floor. They weren't just fleeing, they were navigating. They knew this place. Suddenly, a series of heavy security doors slammed shut further down the aisle, cutting off our direct pursuit. "They're locking us in," I yelled, my mind racing. "They're not just escaping, they're buying time. What are they after?" My eyes scanned the dense array of hardware. This wasn't just a place to hide, it was a tool. The killer wasn't a brute, they were a strategist, a digital architect. They had planned this escape, anticipated this very confrontation, and that made them far more dangerous. This wasn't my trap, it was theirs, and I had walked right into it. A flicker of doubt, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through my resolve. Had I truly been one step behind all along? The realization hit me, a cold wave of certainty washing over the initial shock. This wasn't just a hideout, it was a command center. Every piece of hardware, every blinking light, was part of an intricate network. The killer hadn't just escaped into this quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected. They had orchestrated their presence here, manipulated the circumstances to their advantage. They were a digital architect, yes, but also a master manipulator of physical space. User SZ, the detective's voice, sharp and urgent, cut through the hum of the servers. "Did I find anything?" I turned, my gaze sweeping over the intricate wiring, the glowing screens. "I found the brain, detective, and it's still active." My finger traced a cable that disappeared into a conduit running along the wall, heading deeper into the facility. They're not just hiding. They're controlling the entire building, perhaps. The detective's jaw tightened. Meaning the unknown pathogen suspected might be a smokescreen. I clarified, my mind racing. A sophisticated one, using real-world data to simulate a threat, triggering protocols that would secure this place, making it the perfect, isolated stage for their final act. A flicker on one of the screens caught my eye, a schematic of the quarantine facility. Unknown pathogen suspected. A small red dot labeled active anomaly was moving through the ventilation system. Not a person, but something else. "They're using the infrastructure against us," I breathed. "The air handlers, the security doors, the environmental controls. This isn't just about escaping, it's about dictating the terms of their capture, or perhaps even avoiding it entirely." "Then we need to move," the detective ordered, already signaling to the tactical team. "Containment breach protocol. Secure all exits, but do not engage any automated systems without clearance from user SZ." It was a bold move, trusting my assessment over standard procedure, and I felt a surge of responsibility. We moved through the sterile, echoing corridors of the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected. The air was thick with the faint scent of ozone and disinfectant, a stark contrast to the buzzing energy of the server room. Every door we passed felt like a potential trap, every vent a hidden eye. I kept my gaze fixed on the detective's tablet, which now mirrored the schematic I'd seen, tracking the red dot. It was moving towards one of the older, less monitored sections, a service tunnel network beneath the main structure. "That's it," I whispered, pointing to the screen. "That's their exit strategy. They've been building this, not just planning it." The initial murder was just the first domino. The chase was less about speed and more about calculated movement. The suspect knew every inch of this place, every blind spot, every pressure plate. Then a sudden clang echoed from ahead. A heavy blast door, one designed to seal off sections in case of contamination, began to descend. "They're trying to cut us off," a tactical officer shouted. "No," I countered, my voice firm. "They're trying to herd us. This isn't about escape anymore. It's about a final confrontation, on their terms." My mind flashed back to the victim's meticulously arranged desk, the subtle, almost imperceptible signs of digital intrusion. The killer loved control. We burst into a large, cavernous space, an old, abandoned waste processing area within the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected. In the center, standing calmly beside a reinforced service hatch, was the security systems administrator. My breath hitched. The administrator, the one who had discovered the body, who had so subtly guided our initial investigation, always just a step ahead, always with an explanation that almost made sense. The one whose quiet demeanor I had initially dismissed as competence, not cunning. It's just beginning, detective. The grand finale. The grand finale of what, exactly? I stepped forward, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. Of an elaborate charade. Always looking for the unseen, the unheard. And I found it, I retorted, moving closer, ignoring the detective's subtle warning gesture. I found the ghost in the machine, the digital fingerprints you thought you'd wiped clean, the mechanical alterations you believed were undetectable. I turned to the assembled team, my gaze sweeping from the detective to the armed officers, then back to the administrator. The victim wasn't simply killed in a locked room. They were killed by the room itself. The unknown pathogen suspected was a brilliant diversion, wasn't it, administrator? A way to clear out the facility, giving you free rein. You used the very protocols designed to protect us to create your perfect crime scene. The administrator chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Go on, user SZ, entertain me. The initial call for the unknown pathogen was a fabrication. I began, my voice gaining strength with each word. A digitally synthesized anomaly in the environmental sensors, designed to trigger the lockdown. Once the facility was sealed, you had complete control. The victim's office, the locked room, was equipped with a custom-built, miniaturized pneumatic system, concealed within the wall panels, a system you, as the security administrator, had access to during the facility's last maintenance cycle. It was activated remotely, not by a physical presence, but by a timed command embedded in the facility's network. I paused, letting the implications sink in. The weapon wasn't a knife or a gun. It was a single high-pressure dart, propelled from that pneumatic system, delivering a potent, fast-acting neurotoxin. The entry point was microscopic, designed to leave almost no trace. The dart itself was biodegradable, dissolving within minutes after impact, leaving only the residue of the toxin. And the locked room. The detective pressed, his eyes never leaving the administrator. The locking mechanism on the victim's office door wasn't tampered with physically, I explained. It was digitally overridden. The administrator remotely engaged the deadbolt from the main server, then using a custom-coded script, locked out all external access and wiped the command log. From the outside, it appeared impossibly sealed, no entry, no exit. But for someone with deep access to the facility's network, it was merely a command line. My gaze met the administrator's. You didn't need to be in the room. You just needed to be in control of the network that controlled the room. The impossible murder was a display of technological prowess, a twisted testament to your absolute mastery over this environment. You wanted to prove you could do it, didn't you? That you could execute a perfect, untraceable murder right under everyone's noses, using the very systems you were trusted to protect. The administrator's calm facade finally cracked, until I started sniffing around, user SZ, always digging, always questioning. And the motive? The detective asked. Why the victim? The victim was working on a project, I revealed, recalling the fragmented data I'd recovered from the victim's encrypted files. A new, highly secure encryption algorithm for the facility's core data, something that would have rendered the administrator's backdoors and hidden access points obsolete. They were about to expose my years of covert data manipulation, my illicit access to sensitive information, perhaps even my involvement in a larger network of digital espionage. The victim was a threat, not just to my position, but to my entire operation. So, I eliminated the threat, then used the resulting chaos to stage my escape and hide the evidence in plain sight, deep within the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected. The detective concluded, his voice grim. The administrator let out a sigh, a sound almost of relief. A clean slate, user SZ, a new beginning. I would have vanished without a trace had I not been so persistent. There's no such thing as a clean slate, administrator, I added, my voice quiet but firm. Only forgotten footprints, and I'm very good at finding them. The tactical team moved in, swift and professional. The administrator offered no resistance, their eyes still fixed on me, a strange mix of admiration and resentment. The silence that had settled in the processing area after the administrator was led away wasn't the quiet hum of a laboratory winding down, nor the oppressive stillness of a crime scene. It was something heavier, a thick blanket woven from exhaustion and the lingering chill of a calculated mind finally brought to heel. I remembered the way their eyes had locked onto mine, a strange, almost possessive gaze that suggested a twisted admiration for the chase, for the unraveling of their perfect knot. It had been unsettling, a final psychological jab that echoed in my thoughts long after the door clicked shut behind them. Now, days later, the initial rush of resolution had given way to the methodical grind of legal preparation. The trial wouldn't be a swift affair. The complexity of the digital deception, the sheer audacity of the locked room setup, and the meticulous planning involved meant every piece of evidence, every minute detail, had to be laid bare, dissected, and presented with irrefutable clarity. I sat across from the lead prosecutor, a woman whose sharp intellect was matched only by her relentless pursuit of justice. Her office, unlike mine, was meticulously organized, every file stacked with military precision. She tapped a pen against a thick binder, her brow furrowed. "User SZ, your report is comprehensive," he began, a hint of admiration in his voice, but also the weariness of someone who knew the battle ahead. The digital manipulation of the security logs, the remote activation of the environmental controls to create that specific atmospheric condition, it's brilliant in its depravity. They left a trail, albeit an incredibly faint one, I replied, leaning forward. Every variable accounted for, every escape route sealed. The psychological impact of such a carefully constructed trap. It's what makes this case particularly insidious. It wasn't just murder, it was an elaborate performance, designed to be unsolvable. To mock anyone who tried, the prosecutor finished, nodding. The administrator clearly believed they were untouchable. Their arrogance is almost as damning as their actions. We reviewed the timeline, the evidence linking the administrator to the specific software used, the financial motives disguised as systemic errors, the subtle changes in the victim's routine that had been orchestrated. Each point was a spike in the carefully constructed cage that had been built around the victim, and ultimately around the killer themselves. Despite the capture, a knot of unease still tightened in my stomach. There was one last piece, a physical detail that had been sent off-site for specialized handling. Without it, the how of the impossible weapon, the final undeniable mechanism, remained slightly obscured. Just as we were wrapping up, my comms device buzzed. It was a call from the processing chief, their voice tight with urgency. User SZ. The analysis from the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected, just came in. They've flagged something, you need to see it. A shiver ran down my spine. I'd almost forgotten about that specific sample. Early in the investigation, a minute, almost invisible residue had been found on the victim's personal effects, something that didn't quite fit the immediate cause of death, but was strange enough to warrant extreme caution. My initial thought had been a bizarre misdirection attempt by the killer, but the facility's involvement meant it was more serious. "I'll head there immediately," I told the chief. The prosecutor looked at me, a question in her eyes. "Something else." "A loose end," I explained, rising. "A residue, it could be nothing or it could be the final puzzle piece." The drive to the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected, was a stark contrast to the familiar routes I usually took. This wasn't a place for the mundane, for routine analysis. It was a fortress of sterility, a sterile white behemoth squatting in an isolated patch of land, surrounded by fences and warning signs. The air grew heavy, almost metallic, as I approached. Each gate required a separate authorization, each door sealed with multiple layers of security. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of ventilation systems and the soft padding of my own footsteps. The facility personnel, clad in full protective gear, moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of constant vigilance. I felt the familiar weight of my own protective suit as I donned it, the filtered air hissing around my face. A supervisor, their face obscured by a visor, met me in a decontamination corridor. "User SZ, thank you for coming. We isolated the compound. It's unusual." They led me to a viewing room, separated by a thick pane of reinforced glass from a high-containment laboratory. On a monitor, magnified hundreds of times, was an image that made my breath catch. It wasn't a pathogen in the traditional sense, nor a simple chemical. It was an intricate, crystalline structure, perfectly symmetrical, almost beautiful in its lethal design. "It's a micro-aerosolized agent." The supervisor's voice came through my comms, distorted but clear. "Designed to rapidly crystallize on contact with specific organic compounds, in this case, a protein found in human epithelial tissue. When inhaled, it would cause immediate, localized cellular damage, effectively creating a microscopic, internal lesion that would mimic a natural rupture or even a pre-existing condition, depending on the dosage and location." My mind raced, connecting the dots. The victim's initial symptoms, the confusion surrounding the exact cause of death, the subtle anomalies I'd observed during the initial examination that had been dismissed as inconsequential. It wasn't a poison in the traditional sense, not something that would leave a typical toxicological signature. It was a physical weapon, delivered on a molecular scale. "And the delivery mechanism?" I asked, my voice tight. "That's the other part," the supervisor said, gesturing to another image on the screen. It was a schematic, showing a modified air diffuser, incredibly small, designed to be integrated seamlessly into an existing ventilation system. We found trace elements of the crystalline compound in the filters of the victim's personal environmental unit. The locked room wasn't just about preventing entry, it was about containing the subtle, invisible weapon, ensuring the victim was the only one exposed. The digital manipulation wasn't just about covering tracks. It was about triggering the attack, then erasing the evidence of its deployment. The impossible murder suddenly became terrifyingly possible. The administrator hadn't just killed, they had orchestrated a silent, invisible execution right under everyone's noses. It was a testament to their twisted genius and a stark reminder of how easily the truth could be obscured. This wasn't just evidence for a conviction, it was the definitive explanation of the how, a precise narrative of the victim's last moments. Leaving the sterile confines of the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected, I felt the familiar weight of the world settle back onto my shoulders, heavier now with the full understanding of the killer's depravity. The air outside, though crisp, felt tainted. The legal battle would be long, arduous, and emotionally draining, but now, armed with every piece of the puzzle, I knew we were ready. The silent witnesses had finally spoken, and their testimony was undeniable. The sterile air of the quarantine facility, unknown pathogen suspected, hummed with a low, constant drone, a sound that had become the backdrop to my thoughts for the past few days. It was a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the locked room I'd found myself in just a short while ago, yet both environments shared a peculiar, chilling isolation. I traced the condensation ring my cooling mug left on the polished steel table, my gaze drifting to the thick, reinforced viewport overlooking a series of biohazard containment units. The air beyond those panes shimmered with the heat of constant sterilization. It was over. The impossible had been made horrifyingly possible. The pieces, once scattered like shards of a broken mirror, now formed a clear, if grotesque, picture, and the digital manipulation wasn't just about covering tracks, it was about triggering the attack. A pathogen, designed to be dormant until a specific environmental trigger, a frequency, a chemical signature activated it. The brilliance of it was terrifying, the depravity even more so. I remembered the initial skepticism from the uniformed officers, the way their eyes had glazed over when I started talking about microscopic particles and data streams. My voice, I knew, had a tendency to get lost in the jargon, to sound almost apologetic when I was most certain. That old shadow of doubt, the one that whispered I was always too much or not enough, had tried to creep in then, but this time it hadn't taken root. I'd pushed it back with the weight of every observation, every minute detail, every silent witness I'd coaxed the truth from. The way the victim's internal systems had reacted, the precise, almost surgical manner of their decline, it all pointed to something engineered, something specific. And the subtle flicker in the security camera feed, dismissed as a glitch, had been the key. Not a power surge, but a deliberate, almost imperceptible digital pulse. A command, a release. The killer hadn't needed to step foot in the room, nor leave a physical weapon behind. Their weapon was the air itself, activated by a ghost in the machine. My colleague, a forensics analyst who usually kept a stoic distance, had looked at me differently when the full scope of the plot unfolded. There was a quiet nod, a subtle shift in their posture that spoke volumes. It wasn't praise, not exactly, but it was recognition. And for me, that felt like a sunrise after a very long night. I had always trusted my instincts, even when others hadn't. This case had cemented that trust, not just in my skills, but in myself. The doubt hadn't vanished entirely. I don't think it ever truly does for anyone who seeks truth, but it had shrunk, becoming a manageable whisper instead of a roaring gale. The killer, a brilliant but twisted mind who saw human life as a puzzle to be solved and then discarded, was now contained. The full extent of their digital footprint, meticulously erased, had been painstakingly reconstructed. It had been a battle of wits, a silent war fought across data streams and microscopic evidence. I had won, not with brute force or clever interrogation, but with patience, observation, and an unwavering belief in the story the physical world always tells, no matter how hard someone tries to silence it. A soft chime from the console beside me pulled me from my reverie. A new file icon blinked, bright orange, on the screen. My assistant, a meticulous individual who rarely disturbed me without reason, had sent it. I clicked it open. The attached image was grainy, black and white, depicting a peculiar scene. What looked like a small, intricate wooden box, no larger than a child's shoebox, sat in the center of an otherwise empty room. No dust, no footprints, nothing to indicate how it got there. The accompanying text was sparse. Subject, unexplained appearance. Location, abandoned factory, requesting immediate assessment. I leaned forward, my brow furrowing slightly. An abandoned factory, a mysterious box, no apparent entry or exit for the object. The echo of the last case, the impossible locked room, reverberated through my mind. It seemed the universe wasn't quite done testing my resolve, or perhaps it was merely affirming my purpose. A faint smile touched my lips. The drone of the quarantine facility faded into the background. The familiar prickle of curiosity, the relentless urge to understand what others deemed inexplicable, surged through me. It was a good feeling, a clean, sharp sensation that cut through any lingering weariness. I closed the new file, then reopened it, zooming in on the intricate carvings on the box. Every detail, every imperfection, every silent witness held a story. And I, user SZ, was ready to listen. There were always more truths to uncover, more lies to peel away, more puzzles waiting to be solved. And I was, finally, exactly where I was meant to be.